Hey, scholars. Welcome back to another rousing, thrilling episode of U.S. history. That was the sounds of Diana Ross playing there. We're going to continue talking about the civil rights movement. This is actually going to be the last unit, specifically within our civil rights movement unit. We're also going to continue to move chronologically again. So we're going to be moving on. We're going to stop kind of jumping backwards in history and then going forward. We're talking specifically today about the LGBTQ civil rights movement, the gay civil rights movement. And our goal here is to be able to explain the role of activism in advancing civil rights for the LGBTQ community, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer community. So hopefully you've got your notes out. I have my notes here on my phone. I'm going to be looking over to those over here. I've also got my coffee, of course. I've also given myself a haircut because that's just where we're at in quarantine now. It's fine here, but if I showed you the back, it's terrible. All right, so got our notes. Let's get into gay civil rights. I guess I got to make this bigger. There we go. All right, cool. All right, so let's go to the beginning. And we're going to start. I mean, there's a lot of places we could kind of jump in and start. And we're going to start here around the 1950s. And so to kind of set the scene for the setting, the status of gay civil rights here in the 1950s is almost non-existent. Homosexual behavior is illegal. People who were discovered to be in a gay relationship would potentially face prison sentences, fines, hard labor, once they were in prison. And so police raids, harassment from the police, harassment from, society, your neighbors. That was a fairly common practice in the 1900s. Homosexuality was seen as a mental illness, and as such, it wasn't seen as something that needed civil rights protections or a group of people that needed any kind of protection. And out of that, we see kind of the first LGBT gay rights organizations in the United States, and that is going to be the Mattachine Society here. And we see one of the meetings here of the Mattachine Society. It gets its name from a French secretive medieval performance group where they would all wear masks. And the connection there is that this kind of mirrored what it felt like to be gay in the 1950s in the United States. You couldn't be open about it. You couldn't tell people about it, and so you kind of had to hide that part of your identity. You kind of had to wear a mask yourself whenever you were kind of in the world, right? And the primary goals of this society are really going to be kind of repeated throughout. These core goals are going to be the goals of a few of the different civil rights organizations that we're going to look at today. The first one is to unify people who are isolated from their own kind. So if you're gay, kind of unifying you, making you feel like you're not alone, right? Remember that you had to keep this part of your identity a secret. You couldn't really share it, and you weren't sure who else was kind of in this struggle with you. And so, to kind of unify people, let them know that they're not alone. The second bullet point here, educating people towards gay culture. People, tend to fear that which is unknown. People tend to fear things they don't understand. And so the Mattachine Society was there to try and kind of normalize and familiarize this culture, much in the same way African Americans, Hispanics, Jewish peoples had done. They also wanted to lead those who were more socially conscious, kind of create leaders or create activists in order to create some political changes in the future. And finally, maybe the biggest one here, the most immediate one, is to assist people who were being victimized daily as a result of oppression. Exhibiting homosexual behavior, of course, being in a homosexual relationship, a gay relationship, you absolutely made yourself a victim. You opened yourself up to violence solely for, just kind of being who you were. And so that's kind of our starting point here. That's kind of our temperature check for the status of gay rights in the United States. We see this most visibly in what we call the lavender scare. Yeah, the lavender scare. And so at this time, remember, homosexuality is seen as a mental illness. And so if you were gay, the government felt like you could be blackmailed, that you have this dark secret about you that you couldn't let get out. And therefore, because you have a secret, that you were a security risk. So we're talking 1950. We're talking 1950. And remember, this is after World War II. After World War II, what's the country that we're kind of at war with, but like not really a war? Hopefully you just whispered to yourself, Soviet Union, right? So it was thought that you were a security risk, that the Soviet Union or the communists might try to flip you and turn you into an agent for them. So Senator Joseph McCarthy, who you might remember, he was already accusing people of communists in the government, right? He was kind of going on a witch hunt trying to identify the communists in the government. A lot of people lost their jobs. Senator McCarthy also forced over 90 government officials to resign from their government positions. So basically, Joseph McCarthy and the people who worked for him would be like, hey, we've heard rumors that you're gay. You can either resign, you can either quit, or we're going to publicly announce, we're going to out you, right? And so 1953, this government movement turns into President Eisenhower signing Executive Order 10450. How would you say that? 10450? 10450 sounds catchy. And so what that did was it officially banned gay men and women from working for the federal government. As well, any private companies that were doing business with the government, they also had to fire their gay employees as well. And this results in over 5,000 people being fired from federal employment. Those who were able to avoid being fired now have to kind of like hide that part of themselves even more. And it wasn't just people who were gay working for the government. The government would also keep track of where people were going. Are they going to bars or to clubs or to meetings where other gay people are? Do they have family members who are gay, right? Because that's potentially a blackmail or a national security risk, right? In this executive order, that actually stays on paper. It stays in effect all the way up until 1995. Right? So it starts in 1953 and it's just there. It's just a part of the government until 1995. So kind of the biggest jumping off point here for gay rights activism, the thing that kind of brings it to the national forefront, national conversation, is going to be the Stonewall riot in 1969. Boy, 1968, 1969, just like everything is happening in the late 60s, right? So Stonewall riot, what's happening here? Well, remember, homosexual behavior is illegal. Dressing in any way that didn't match your gender, that's illegal. Dancing even is highly regulated in New York City. And so naturally, bars and nightclubs kind of become a refuge, a safe place where if you're gay, you can go and you don't have to worry about being harassed, being attacked. What's interesting here is that the Italian mafia actually ran most of the gay bars in New York City, including the one that we're going to talk about today, the Stonewall Inn. So the Italian mafia ran these bars, and they would pay off the police and keep the police from shutting down these bars. A lot of these bars didn't have a license to run. They didn't actually really meet the building codes or health codes or safety codes. There's one story with specifically the Stonewall Inn, the place we're going to be talking about today, where like they didn't even have running water, and so they wouldn't clean the glasses. Like they would just like dunk them in water and like good to go. So that's beside the point. So the Italian mafia would pay off the police and keep the police from shutting down these gay bars. Well, the mafia stopped paying off the police, supposedly, and there was a surprise police raid. And the way these raids usually worked is that the police would force everyone out of the bar. They would check everyone's ID. They would check to see, like, does this person seem like they're engaging in homosexual or gay behavior? And if they felt like you were, or if they felt like maybe you were dressed a little too differently, you would go to jail, right? You would be fined. So the police force everyone out, and they start checking people's IDs. And, at this point, it was kind of a breaking point for the gay community. They were tired of being harassed. They were tired of being forced out and playing these games with police. And a crowd of about 500 people start gathering. And, we're not sure how it starts, but someone threw something, and gradually people start yelling at the police. They start, throwing more things. And the police, they lock themselves inside the Stonewall Inn. And riots occur for like 6 days. And it really only ends when windows of the bar are smashed. Remember, the police have locked themselves inside, and they actually set the bar on fire, right? So they set the bar on fire. And the reason this is so historically significant, the police were able to escape. I don't know if anyone was wondering. But the reason it's so significant is because thousands of people ended up being involved. Bob Dylan even was in the neighborhood, and he saw this was happening, and he kind of joined in the riots as well. Bob Dylan, the famous musician, I'm sure we're all familiar. But thousands of people were involved. The riot lasted for 6 days, and it was also the first riot to get major media coverage. It's not the first riot for gay civil rights in history. There's one actually at a donut shop. There was one at a restaurant before. But this one gets major media coverage, and it kind of puts the issue of gay civil rights and the harassment that they were facing, it puts that on kind of the national stage, and it makes a conversation piece. Out of this event, we also get some new organizations, the Gay Liberation Front, the Gay Activists Alliance, Radical Lesbians, I like that one just because, they mash up the words, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, transvestite, kind of an aged, like an older word, we would say trans now. But this Stonewall Inn also, historically, declared a national monument in 2016 by Barack Obama. So we see the little... right there, the plaque. Maybe one day, go to New York City, check it out. I mean, it's quarantine now, but one day we'll be able to fly. So I wanted to pull a primary source here for us to look at, and go ahead and you can pause the video and read this on your own, and I'll have the PDF as well. But here we have, just to give you some background, this is a news excerpt from just after the riots ended, where someone, a reporter, interviewed some people here about what happened. So go ahead and pause, read through it, and then we'll talk about what's in this document together. So I'll give you a chance to pause it. Okay, so you've had a chance to read through it. First sentence, according to reports, the Stonewall Inn was a mecca. Mecca, they mean that as a metaphor for like a large gathering place. For the homosexual element. So it's interesting they say the element, the homosexual element, right? Like, they're not necessarily people, they mean it as like this influence in our city. In the village, we continue on, who wanted nothing but a private little place where they could congregate, drink, dance, and do whatever little girls do when they get together. So let's pause right there. So this is written in 1969. Hopefully we looked down here at the bottom. We saw kind of the time and the date. And there's kind of this condescending tone in this document where it's like these people are there to do whatever little girls do. Like, these are grown, like, adults, right? These are grown men and women. And they're kind of like being demeaning, talking down, saying that these are just like, unnatural, kind of like weird people doing whatever little girls do, right? So this article kind of has a tone to it, right? Has a perspective, has an angle. Last Friday, the privacy of the Stonewall was invaded by police from the 1st Division. It was a raid. They had a warrant. After 2 years, police said they had been informed that liquor was being served on the premises. So here, the reporter is going to be interviewing two different sides. And in this section here with Bruce and Nan, these are refugees from Indiana. Huh? That's actually why I chose it. They're from Indiana. But they came to New York. They're a gay couple, and they felt like they would face less harassment in New York. And from their perspective, they're like, the reason the police came in here was because the mafia stopped paying them off, right? The cops came in here, they started smashing stuff. Things were fine for the past 2 years, and now all of a sudden the police want to smash the place up. How come they couldn't leave us alone? And the reporter here, he turns in this last paragraph, he turns to the perspective of the police officers, and he's like, well, the police officers, he says, are unable to find any humor in the situation despite the comical overtones of the raid. So let's pause right there. The reporter is calling the raid comical, is calling the riots comical, right? Well, what's so funny about it? What's so comical about it? We look at it, and it's kind of this fight for civil rights. At the time, the majority of people are looking at it, right? The conservative majority is looking at this, and they're saying, isn't it weird? Isn't it so funny and kind of odd and interesting that this group of people is trying to fight for equal rights? Like, how comical, how humorous. And so here in the last section, we're seeing the police perspective is talking about how, they had things thrown at them, which is absolutely true, right? I was almost decapitated by a slab of thick glass. The beer can didn't miss, though. And it does here conclude at the end, the police did take the cash register as proceeds from an illegal operation. So that's, there's definitely some incentive here. The mafia, the money, the police, right? There's something deeper here in addition to the general harassment of the gay community, right? So we'll have some questions about that document. So moving forward, out of the Stonewall riot we talked about, we see some gay rights activism, right? Some different things happening as a result. For example, the Gay Liberation Front, broad goals, really about denouncing racism, denouncing the violence that was happening to the gay community. They supported international struggles. They supported the Black Panther Party, right? They were generally anti-capitalist, and they're really looking to kind of end discrimination just wholesale across the board. We also have STAR. We talked about them on the previous slide. Can I go back? I can. That's the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. What are they about? Well, they're there to provide shelter and food to homeless queer youth. So if you're gay, typically it wasn't uncommon to get kicked out of the house, right? Your family wouldn't accept you. You would end up homeless. So STAR was founded by Sylvia Rivera and Marsha Johnson to help those people who had no home, who had no resources, who kind of had no family anymore. On a more national stage, we also have Harvey Milk. He's the first openly gay man elected to public office in the United States. And in California, in San Francisco, he helps to pass a lot of gay rights ordinances, like civil rights protections. And so he becomes an icon in that way. He kind of shows what's possible, shows the advancement here. We also have, even more nationally, we have the March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights, right? So another March on Washington. And so we have, huge crowd once again, in the 100,000s. This is happening in 1979, right? So we're 10 years out from the Stonewall riot. And we have a quote. You can see how influential Harvey Milk was. Rights are not won on paper. They are won only by those who make their voices heard. Right? So he's being quoted here at this national rally. And down here, we have the AIDS quilt. We're going to be talking about AIDS on the next slide. But at this point, a lot of people are dying from this disease called AIDS. And this was kind of a symbol of the support and the recognition that people were calling for. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about this epidemic. Speaking of epidemics, hey, that's kind of current, right? We got our own epidemic. So what's the AIDS epidemic? Well, this is very closely linked to the gay community because of the discrimination that it kind of forced the gay community to go through. So what is AIDS? Well, AIDS is a blood-borne virus, right? It's transmitted through blood, not through spit, not through sweat. Or skin-to-skin contact, right? It's transmitted through blood, and it severely weakens the immune system. And AIDS is actually the final stage of another disease, virus, right? HIV, right? So HIV eventually progresses into AIDS. Well, 1980, this was a brand new thing, right? No one had ever seen anything like this before. All of a sudden, people were suddenly getting extremely sick. Their immune systems were reduced to nothing, and people started getting these like very obscure, weird diseases and forms of cancer that no one had ever gotten before. And so in 1980, they just thought it was a contagious form of cancer. It was initially called the gay-related immune disorder because this was happening a lot among gay men, right? And so initially it was thought to only be a gay community-related disease. Eventually, it turns out that it's not just the gay community, but it's also people who used drugs, specifically needles and shared needles, as well as, more generally, hemophiliacs. So people who, for one reason or another, their blood doesn't clot very well. So like instead of forming a scab, like they just keep bleeding. And so often they need blood transfusions. But people still associated it with the gay community, right? And so it's not until an Indiana teen named Ryan White from Kokomo, Indiana, he gets AIDS from a blood transfusion and is barred from going to school. And this kind of changes the national conversation about AIDS, and it shifts it away from being specifically seen as a gay-related disease to being a disease that anyone could get, right? That anyone was susceptible to. And that's what kind of kept it from receiving any kind of additional government attention, was that the government thought it was specifically like, well, it's a gay-related problem. And no, Ryan White kind of showed that anyone was able to get this. Ryan White, by the way, Ryan here is going to be our secret word for the lecture, here highlighted in yellow. Ryan, R-Y-A-N, all caps, lowercase, whatever you want. Ryan's the secret word. But Ryan, he's diagnosed with AIDS, and he was actually barred from going to school. And you see here in this picture, he had to attend school over the phone, over speakerphone. He had to, like, they set up a phone in the classroom, and he was expected to follow along with all the other kids without being able to see what was happening in the classroom. He was constantly bullied. He wanted to go to school. His doctors told the school, like, he's fine. He's not going to transmit AIDS to the other kids just by being in the room. And the school did not allow him to go to school. And Ryan would eventually go on to die from AIDS. And he kind of launches it into a national platform, national stage. What's happening though? What's the government's response here to the AIDS epidemic? Well, it takes 5 years for the president to even acknowledge and address the AIDS epidemic, and in that time period, 12,000 Americans had died from AIDS. And people were, specifically the gay community, were very critical of the government, that the government wasn't doing anything about AIDS. They weren't trying to find a cure, that the government wasn't trying to offer support to those who were affected by AIDS. We see here in this image that people started to act against the gay community because they were like, the gay community is causing AIDS, right? Which isn't the case at all. But, people fear the things they don't understand. And we even see here the Surgeon General, right, who's part of the government, represents medical knowledge from the government's perspective. He ends up sending this document here, this flyer, out to every American home, and he's actually asked to step down, right, basically fired from the government, because he's seen as acting out of line. And so 1987, only one drug was approved finally for treating AIDS, but even then it costs $10,000 a year, and it pretty much just made people sick, if not sicker than having AIDS itself. And it's through activism that the FDA, that the government is willing to recognize other forms of medicine that can treat AIDS, right? So the gay community is able to go out and kind of protest enough for the government to listen. And in 1990, passed by President Bush here, we'll talk about in a future lesson. He provides funding to help improve the quality and availability of medication, of AIDS care, right? And that's still in effect today, and it's still hugely beneficial to helping people afford the medications that are necessary to treat HIV and AIDS. We're talking about here, by the way, going back to this 1987 point, AZT. So the gay community is able to protest against the government because the government was not allowing other medications to be released, and people were having to order medicine from China and Mexico where those were available, and the governments weren't stopping those from being released on the market. And the big change in treating AIDS, in treating HIV, comes through this guy named Larry Kramer. He forms an organization called ACT UP, and he started out heavily criticizing the head of the National Institute for Health. His name is Dr. Anthony Fauci. Maybe that's familiar if you've been watching the news at all. Anthony Fauci was a guy who was initially in charge of treating the AIDS epidemic, and now he's in charge of treating coronavirus, COVID-19. But the gay community is able to lobby Dr. Fauci and get him to understand that there are other drugs out there and that these are going to be more beneficial towards helping HIV, towards helping treat AIDS. So where does the federal government stand now as a result of gay rights activism? Well, in 1994, 1995, remember that executive order that President Eisenhower, he put in, and he was like, no gay people can work for the government? Well, President Bill Clinton, he changes it to a thing called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which is kind of different. Under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that policy was the government isn't going to investigate if people are gay or not, but gay people also cannot talk about it. They cannot disclose that about themselves, right? That's the don't tell part. Otherwise, they face being discharged or fired from the government. And so that executive order changes a little bit in 1994, 1995. It's no longer policy, though. It was overturned by President Barack Obama in 2010. And much of the gay civil rights protections have actually developed out of government interpretation of existing laws, right? So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was decided, does not allow discrimination based on if you're gay or not in the workplace. And there've been a few Supreme Court cases where the Supreme Court has had to look at the Constitution and decide the Constitution protects someone's right to have a gay relationship. It protects someone's right to have their marriage recognized. And we've also had some kind of hate crimes prevention laws put in place, but for the most part, there is no current federal law that protects someone who is gay or part of the LGBTQ community. There is no current federal law that protects them. Much of the protections that have come through have been a result of government interpretation of existing law, but there have really not been any brand new laws for the gay community. So that was our whirlwind lecture through LGBTQ rights. Well done. We're on to the next thing. Nice work. See you later. Bye.